Hey guys, in today's lecture we'll be talking about morphometrics, skull morphology, and dentition, which is a pretty fun topic. Skulls are really neat, and teeths are pretty fun to learn about, so let's go. So what is morphometrics? Here's the long, obnoxious scientific answer. It's the quantitative study of form in 2 or 3-dimensional space that enables a scientist to characterize structures, also known as forms, and conduct statistical analyses and comparisons of these structures. So let's break that down. So 2 or 3-dimensional space, meaning like you can kind of imagine like drawing a structure, be like 2-dimensional, and 3-dimensional is the whole thing. You know, it could be either. It often ends up being 3-dimensional. So the structures they're referring to could be anything such as like a whole organism. It could be part of an organism, like its leg bones or a single tooth. It could even be stuff at the cellular level. It could be any of those. The statistical analyses that are conducted are used for better understanding the dimensions of these structures and allows you to compare them. You could be comparing to like members of its own species. You could be comparing to other species. It doesn't matter. It's broad on purpose, which means it's basically kind of a mix of geometry and biology. So it's got wide applications in a lot of different parts of biology and even parts of like kind of unrelated biology. So like in fossils, you could look through the fossil record. For example, we could be comparing human teeth to like our ancestors and seeing how that changes over time. So that informs us on evolutionary records. Medical activities, you could be looking into what is the average dimensions of, say, a kidney. And so because you've got a whole lot of data to compare to, you could pick out if someone has a weird kidney or something like that. You know, it's broad. So here's a bit of basic skull morphology. So skulls have specific sites for tissues and muscle attachment, especially like jaw muscles, eyeballs, ears, things like that. The orbit is sort of the holes in the skull where the eyeballs sit. Nasal passages are for smelling and for breathing. I'm sure you can pick those out where the nostrils are. Skulls have a protective cavity for the brain, which is obviously super important. And remember, we're talking about mammals and stuff. And then there's 2 main parts. You've got the cranium, which is kind of the whole thing, and then you've got the mandible, which is like the jaw. And then if we're talking about important parts of the skull, obviously the teeth are pretty important for existence. So for teeth, we've got 4 major types. You've got incisors at the front of the mouth, which tend to be for biting, grasping, and scraping and gnawing. You've got canines, which are the pointy ones. That's for stabbing and holding prey. Then you've got the premolars, which are also called transitional teeth, and they tend to vary in shape and size. So they perform lots of duties depending on what species we're discussing. So they're typically for chewing, gripping, and tearing. And then you've got the molars in the back, which are for get your crunch on. They have many cusps, little points, I believe, and tend to be flatter and wider, which is helpful for grinding and breaking up food. So here are the incisors. Here's the canine. It's the pointy. Here's the premolars, which depend on what species we're talking about. Their shape can be very different. And then here's the molars in the back. So like our wisdom tooth or teeth, depending on what you get, are a type of molar. Your molars are in the back. Your premolars kind of look like your molars for people. And teeth are pretty neat because they can tell us a lot about an organism. Eating is obviously one of the main things you need to do to function and exist. So teeth are really, really important because they're basically what allow us to or a lot of species at least, capture prey and to begin to break it down. So they have a major impact on an organism's life history. They tell us what the organism eats generally. So there's 4 main types of diet that we will go into. There's carnivores, which are meat eaters, herbivores, which are plant eaters, omnivores, which are generalists, they'll eat both, they don't care, and insectivores, which is basically a type of carnivore, and they specialize in insects. But keep in mind that there's a lot of different other types of specialists. Never underestimate the ability of a random organism to be obnoxiously specialized. There are piscivores, which are fish-eating specialists. There's frugivores, which are fruit-eating specialists. There's a type of vor for any type for any food you can think of. So, carnivore teeth. We'll get into the 4 different types. So carnivore teeth, they're meat eaters. Typically they have smaller incisors. They have very pronounced canines for gripping prey. If you get something, there's so much energy that you have to put into catching it. You definitely don't want to ever risk it running away immediately after you catch it. So canines are very important in that aspect. And then premolars and molars tend to be tall and pointier for cutting and tearing flesh. So here's some examples. So over here you've got the wolf. You can see the incisors up here. Here's the canines. This tooth looks chipped, but they're usually even longer, and that really helps with gripping like fast-moving prey, like hares or caribou. Depends on where the wolf lives. Over here you've got your premolars, and then you've got your molars in the back. See how big they are, but they're very pointed. They're not super grindy, so it's good for tearing off flesh and chewing into it and scraping off bone and stuff like that. Tigers got basically the same thing, except they have even bigger boy teeth for canines. They're very stabby. Up here is a spotted hyena. Hyenas are really cool. They're highly efficient predators. I could talk about hyenas forever. They're really misunderstood, but I put them in here because yes, they are carnivores, and a big part of what makes them unique is they can digest and eat bone. So they've got these big powerful molars in the back for crunching into things that most other species can't really digest, which gives them, extra food sources that others can't use. But they've still got these big canines in the front for capturing prey, etc. So cool dudes. And then we've got herbivore teeth. So those guys are the plant eaters. They have large, well-developed incisors for cutting plant tissue generally. That can kind of vary. All of these vary. Trust me, there's never a hard rule in biology, I swear. There's always an exception. A lot of them kind of lack canines, or they resemble or work like incisors. Premolars and molars tend to be very flat, and they have the small ridge-like cusps, which is helpful in grinding plant tissue. But remember, all this stuff can vary depending on other aspects of an animal's life history. I should have put an example of some of that, but we'll go through some of the examples right here. So here's some herbivore teeth. Over here we have a horse. You can see they've got the ridge-like cusps or whatever, and the big flat molars and premolars all just kind of look the same because they're standing around eating all the time, being all boring and majestic in fields. And then they've got the incisors in the front, which they use for like ripping off bits of plant as well. They use their lips as well, but obviously since we're just talking about bone, you're not going to see all the soft tissue here. Here's the nasal cavity, big nostril, big passages for breathing, probably helps with running and stuff like that. Up here I put a koala. Koalas are extra specialist herbivores. They really only eat eucalyptus. They got these kind of pointier incisors, I believe, for ripping off plants. the eucalyptus leaves, and then in the back you've got your molars for grinding. And then over here we've actually got a deer skull. So deer are kind of weird. They've only got incisors on the bottom of the jaw, and they have a really hard palate that they just sort of grip plants and then they tear, pressing the incisors against that hard palate, and then you've got the grinders in the back. But remember, all this can vary. So, for example, elephants, you know how elephants have large tusks if they haven't been slaughtered for poaching for no reason, basically? Those tusks are modified canine teeth, and they don't really function in eating, they function in defense. So teeth can have more than just one function, of course. They don't have to be purely for eating. They can be adapted or modified, sorry. They can be modified to function in other ways. And that's really how a lot of adaptations pop up. You'll have body parts that you just sort of, you know, use what you got, and it can be used for other functions through evolutionary time eventually. And then we've got omnivore teeth. These guys are generalists. They tend to do very well because they can use one food source or another depending on like seasonality. They tend to have large, well-developed incisors and canines. And molars and premolars have cusps for grinding meat in plants. So here's some omnivore teeth. Over here is a grizzly bear. Grizzly bears we often think of as being pure meat eaters, but a huge amount of their diet is stuff like grass and berries and things like that. They're very intelligent, and they'll use whatever they can find. You can see these big canines are, so they fight each other, so the canines can be helpful in that aspect, but think about eating things like salmon. It's helpful to have large canines for grip and stuff like that. But yeah, so these kind of follow along the basic mold with just extra large, terrifying canines. Back here you've got your little grinding molars and premolars. Humans are omnivorous. Our canines are kind of weak and sad generally, but they're still there. They're still somewhat pointed. Here are our incisors. Here's our canine. These guys are our premolars. And then back here you've got our molars, including our wisdom tooth, which tends to be taken out because our mouths are kind of dumb now. But yeah, people are omnivores. And then over here I put a rat skull. So they've got these big incisors, which allows them to chew into things like the husks of seeds and stuff like that, but back here they're still for grinding. So a lot of what they eat tends to be plants, but rats are really opportunistic. They'll eat eggs, they'll eat garbage, they'll eat insects, they'll eat small reptiles and amphibians. Anything they can eat, they'll go for it. That's why they're so successful. And then we've got insectivore teeth. They're kind of weird. So there's not a lot of like highly specific insectivores. Not a ton as far as mammals go. But there are a couple really interesting examples. So they have a whole bunch of teeth that tend to be small and sharp, and most of them kind of look the same. And that helps with capturing insects and eating them. So this is an eastern mole. It's terrifying looking, but it is what it is. So as you can see, a lot of the teeth are kind of shaped basically the same. Molars back here, premolars, canines, incisors in the front. And then down here we've got a hedgehog, and most of the teeth are very similarly shaped, and so they're insectivores as well. So that's skull, bits and pieces, morphometrics, etc. It's a pretty fun topic, talking about different forms of teeth. I find it pretty interesting. I didn't have a ton of examples here, but if y'all ever want to ask about it, I can find some cool ones. And we're only talking about mammals in this video. There's tons of cool variation in other kinds of organism as well. So that's that.